G'day hikers and welcome to the 2020 Hike the Highlands Virtual Festival. My name is Tom Wilson. I'll be your host today, and we're fortunate to have a special guest on our show today, and her name is Kelly Deveaux, and she's the Visitor Service Manager with Cape Breton Highlands National Park. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, virtually. As Tom said, my name is Kelly Deveaux. I'm the Visitor Experience Manager here at Cape Breton Highlands National Park. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia. I'd also like to just recognize, Tom, you and your team at Hike the Highlands, and just note how much we value our partnership with Hike the Highlands. You guys deserve a big thank you to you, Tom, and everyone on your board for all the hard work, the adaptability and the flexibility in making the festival a reality in our new COVID-19 reality. When Tom first invited me to present during this virtual festival about how we've changed here at Cape Breton Highlands National Park in a COVID context, it actually gave me an opportunity to pause and reflect on the last 6 months, which at times just seemed like a complete whirlwind. The past 6 months have definitely been filled with much uncertainty, much unknown, and a lot of change. And really moving forward, we can expect with absolute certainty that the uncertainty will probably continue into the foreseeable future. And with that in mind, I think it's important to remember that we really are all in this together. So today, this morning, I'm going to run through a couple of slides during our time together to share how our operation changed here at Cape Breton Highlands National Park in the COVID context. I'm going to share some principles that guided us through this change, but at the same time, those principles really kept us rooted. And I'll also talk a little bit about the role of our visitors, and finally offer some reflection on moving forward. So I'll speak for about 20 minutes, 15-20 minutes, and maybe allow some time for questions if Tom has any questions. Before sharing how we changed and adapted our operation, it is important to understand what was at the root of our planning and our decision making. And I'm going to share 5 principles that have and will continue to guide us along. And I wanted to start off by focusing on these 5 principles for a moment. So I've put them all on one slide for us. So we're going to bring that up, advance to the next slide, and we'll run through our 5 guiding principles for our resumption planning in Parks Canada. So the first one was all about the health and safety of our Parks Canada team. All of our decisions were really focused on the health and safety of our people. So our employees, Canadians, visitors, and this will obviously continue to be the first consideration in all of our decisions. Our second guiding principle for resuming our operations was that Parks Canada has and will continue to take an adaptive and flexible approach to managing the situation. And our third guiding principle was that the resumption of activities has and will continue to occur in an incremental manner. And I will talk a lot about the incremental approach we took. And resumption of activities will also be aligned with our capacity and availability of necessary tools. So in the beginning, some of those necessary tools were things like PPE. And of course, local conditions and direction from public health officials also factors into our resumption planning. Our fourth guiding principle in resuming our operations was that decisions would be, and they have been, and they'll continue to be, fiscally strategic. The impacts of lost revenue for Parks Canada and the impacts of COVID-19 on local economies are considered in our decision making. And our fifth guiding principle was that Parks Canada would ensure that any of our legislative or contractual obligations would continue to be met. So, for example, one of our legislative requirements at Cape Breton Highlands was our management planning. So back in March, we were in the midst of public consultation for our management plan, which had to be paused and appropriately deferred. So much like the situation this spring and summer, will continue to evolve, but guided by these principles as we head into wave 2, which our health experts are strongly cautioning us about. So let's take a step back, way back to March. Before I get into more detail about how we resumed our operations, we have to rewind the clock to March. So March 18th, this was our closure date due to COVID-19. And that meant that all visitor access to our places ceased. It required us to determine critical services, and that meant that many of our colleagues had to remain at home. Those who remained in our workplace were there for critical services. So Breton Highlands, that meant keeping the Cabot Trail clear of snow and maintaining that important through highway for our communities. But it wasn't soon after we closed on March 18th that we started thinking about reopening and how we were going to reopen in this new context and how we were going to be able to welcome visitors into our places again. And we were not alone in these early thoughts, I guess, in the early days in late March. As you know, Parks Canada has a large network of national parks, historic sites, and marine conservation areas spread across the country. To support our resumption plans. And again, those plans were rooted in those 5 principles that I shared on that previous slide. So I can get into a little bit of detail about the incremental reopening of our places. So business resumption at Parks Canada was separated into 4 very distinct stages, and you'll see them here on the screen, stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. So in relation to Cape Breton Highlands National Park, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail. Now, remember, this is pretty high level. It's a synopsis. There was a lot of detailed planning that took place, but for the purposes of today's presentation, I'll give a bit of an overview. So our stage 1 resumption of our places was just that initial level of service. So this started on June 1st. So on June 1st, we saw the reopening of select trails and green spaces in Cape Breton Highlands National Park. This was an important day for all of us because Parks Canada recognizes that connecting with nature is so important for Canadians. And as such, we worked hard with our colleagues and with our teams here to get to this June 1st reopening of green spaces. And we followed the advice of public health experts. We took the necessary measures to reduce the risks to our visitors, our employees, and other users so that Canadians could reconnect with their much loved and much missed outdoor spaces in the Parks Canada network. In Cape Breton Highlands, June 1st did not see the reopening of the Skyline Trail or the Middlehead Trail. So those trails only opened a few weeks after, and at first the Skyline reopened at a reduced capacity. So the next incremental step after we got through June 1st was stage 2. So that's overnight stays. And that started to roll out for Cape Breton Highlands on June 22nd. And it started with a limited socially distanced camping offer in our national park, which was limited to our self-registration campgrounds only. So that was Big Interval and Macintosh Brook. Then the next step within stage 2 of our incremental reopening of overnight stays was on June 29th. So that's when our RV sections opened in our 2 major campgrounds, Shetty Camp and Broad Cove, and they were limited to self-contained RVs. Then the next step was July 6th, and that was Fishing Cove that opened then. And then on the 13th of July, our tenting sections opened at reduced occupancy and reduced washrooms in our 3 major campgrounds, so Shetty Camp, Broad Cove, and Ingonish Beach. The next incremental phase of reopening our operations was stage 3. So as you see on the screen here, it's activities and interpretation. So June 13th was also a really pivotal date for our colleagues at the National Historic Sites in Cape Breton, so Alexander Graham Bell and the Fortress of Louisbourg National Historic Site. So on the 13th of July, Alexander Graham Bell National Historic Site reopened its doors, and then on the 20th, the Fortress opened its doors. And at the same time, our visitor centers here in Cape Breton Highlands National Park also opened our doors. And we saw select interpretation at our look-offs on the roadside on the Cabot Trail at a distance. The last stage, stage 4, is identified as recovery. So this really speaks to that final phase of reopening our spaces, and some examples would be our gift shops, both the merchandise that we sell at the Ingonish Visitor Center and also the Shetty Camp Visitor Center, the bookstore that Les Amis, our operating association, runs. And then we were also offering some evening programs in our campgrounds with limited and spaced out seating in an outdoor setting. So with each stage, again, those 5 guiding principles were really rooted in our decisions. And also, I think it's important to note that when we were reopening, communications was critically important. A strong communications plan was put in place at each stage, and that included media relations, social media, stakeholder communications, and really driving everyone to our website for the latest information on our reopening and resumption plans. And that was really important to have our website be that focal point, because things were shifting pretty quickly at that time. So making sure that everyone was going to the website for the most up-to-date information was really critical. So with all of this careful planning and with each incremental stage in our resumption planning, the question remains, how did the pandemic actually change our operations here on the ground in Cape Breton Highlands National Park? You know, it's one thing to go from detailed plans to rolling things out on the ground. So in the next slide, I thought I would answer that question with just a couple of pictures that really capture and summarize the changes on the ground. So as you see, we have a lot more signage in our places, both indoors and outdoors. So hikers like those participating in Hike the Highlands will see signs like the one on the right here on the screen. All of our trailheads in Cape Breton Highlands National Park boast new signage to remind our visitors to practice physical distancing. We also have enhanced cleaning, and actually I'll take a moment to give a shout out to my amazing team of cleaners who take pride in their work, and we're certainly grateful for the essential role that they play on our team. So some other changes, we have limited capacity in our washrooms. We have reduced occupancy, as I mentioned earlier, in our campgrounds. As you see in the photo here on the left, we have plexiglass at our visitor centers. We have sanitation stations. And now that masks are mandatory in Nova Scotia, we even have masks on hand for visitors who forget theirs. So we've put many measures in place for the safety of our staff and our visitors. But I think it's important to note, though, that one thing hasn't changed, and that's our welcoming staff. As you see in this photo here on the left, we've really mastered the art of smizing, so that unmistakable smile with your eyes. And of course, something else that hasn't changed, our natural landscape, our breathtaking views, the incredible hiking offer. Those things haven't changed. Cape Breton Highlands National Park is still a remarkable bucket list hiking destination. So now that I've talked a little bit about what we've done and how we've changed on the ground, I'd like to talk about our visitors and how our visitors are also adapting to our COVID reality in Breton Highlands National Park. So as Parks Canada Places reopened, we asked our visitors to help us out and to follow the advice of public health experts. We also asked our visitors to plan ahead and be prepared. So bring wipes, bring sanitizer, bring tablecloths for the picnic tables. We also asked our visitors to respect the signage and respect the measures that we put in place. We've also been asking our visitors to just practice a little patience because we're all adjusting to this new context. And we've also been sharing that reminder that maybe the experience is going to be different in some ways that our visitors wouldn't normally be used to. So this slide speaks specifically to some reminders for hikers. So our hikers are also adapting with us, and we've always encouraged good hiker etiquette, as Tom and everyone who participates in Hike the Highlands knows. But this year we've added a few things to the hiker etiquette. And actually it was the previous slide, no, on this slide actually, you'll see here there's a yellow sign in addition to our green sign at trailheads to remind hikers to practice physical distancing. We also have this yellow sign that offers a few more tips, and I have them on the screen here. I'll just mention them pretty quickly, and they may be familiar already to everyone who's listening. So trails with less traffic are going to be easier to practice social distancing on. So if you pull in at a parking lot and it's busy, try another trail, or come back at a non-peak time. So what we're seeing this year is that the weekends are very busy, and the weekdays and off-peak hours are not busy. So do keep that in mind if you're planning to hike a more popular trail that probably would be busy on a weekend. We're also asking hikers, if you run into another person on the trail, just step to the right, especially if that person's going uphill, and just give your fellow hikers some distance so that everyone can pass safely. Be patient. So I think that's been a theme this summer, be patient. Physical distancing does require more time. So if someone in front of you is checking out a view or pausing to look at interesting flora or fauna or some other neat feature on a trail, just be patient. And of course, hikers know to pack a proper bag. And we usually advise that bag should include water, sunscreen, snacks, bug spray. And this year we're suggesting that that bag should also include hand sanitizer and a non-medical mask. And one last tip for hikers, just try visiting trails that are closest to your home. It's best to stay local, especially for this year. So these are some of the tips that we're sharing with our visitors. And we share tips like through our social media channels, on our website, and through on-site signage like you see on the right of your screen there. The vast majority of our visitors are conscientious, and are following the tips, and they're following our signage, and they're respecting the measures that we put in place, and we greatly appreciate that. So that's an overview, a really quick overview of what the past 6 months have been like. Really, it's a summary of how we had to pause and then how we had to pivot in this COVID-19 context. There's been a lot of change, a lot of adaptability and flexibility, but really everything has been rooted in those 5 principles. We can tie everything back to those 5 principles. On the next slide, I'm going to just briefly capture some thoughts about the future. I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm sure lots of people wish that they did. But I think it's important to just share some thoughts about the future. So really there are more considerations, I guess, for moving forward. The reality is that COVID-19 will be around for the foreseeable future. So we need to ask ourselves what sorts of changes do we see on the horizon for our operation and our industry, really. A year ago, I don't think any of us could have imagined what we're seeing and living today. So some of the questions that we're pondering as this pandemic evolves include things like visitor behavior. How will visitors change? How will visitor behavior change? Or visitor expectations? How will visitor expectations change, both during the remainder of the pandemic and then afterwards as well? And I know everyone is already trying to forecast how travel will change, that larger travel industry, and what travel trends are going to look like as a whole. We're also pondering questions like, how do we better encourage a shared responsibility in our places and also that responsible enjoyment of our places? We're also asking ourselves, how do we embrace new ways of reaching visitors, where they live, where they work, and where they get informed, and learning from partners actually like Hike the Highlands, who are hosting events like this virtually and proving that it can be done and can be done well. We're also thinking about how we can better understand our local market and our regional market. And we're talking about how our planning needs to change. So for things like future trail designs, do we plan for wider trails so physical distancing is easier? Do we reconfigure? Do we make loops? So all these sorts of questions are coming into play. And we're thinking about our facilities, our washrooms, our day use areas, all in the context of physical distancing during a pandemic. So there's many, many questions that we're posing. Another important one is just about that mental and physical health of our staff and our team and our visitors as well. So lots of questions to ponder about the future. And we're asking ourselves these questions, and we're discussing these questions with partners as we look ahead, because really one thing is for certain, and that's that we're going to be looking at everything through the lens of COVID-19 for the next couple of years. And we will seek to better understand the longer term impacts of our operation if we're asking these questions and we're using that lens so that we can adapt and plan accordingly. So I started off by talking about our 5 principles earlier that really guided us and will continue to be deeply rooted in our decision making as we look into the future and ask these questions to ourselves. But that first principle will always remain a constant, and that is the safety of people, so our team and our visitors as well. So that's about it. I'm going to unshare my screen video in case Tom has any questions for me.
Well, I actually have a couple. Actually, some are more comments than anything else, but when we talk about virtual events, that was a totally new concept that I learned this year, as well as Zoom. Nobody even heard of Zoom. Nobody heard of virtual events before. And I want to give an example of a community. It's in Ireland, and it's the Cape Clear Island. It's the most southern part of the Republic of Ireland. And they had a concert, live concert through Facebook, and they raised over 2,500 euros to help renovate their church. And there's a clear example of thinking outside the box, and saying, we can do this. And so I think that's the way we have to approach probably the next couple of years, is that we can't stop. We have to keep moving forward, and we have to learn how to do things a little bit differently. And I think you brought that up quite a bit in your presentation. One of the, I interviewed a chap from PEI who's on the board of directors for Island Trails. And in PEI, most of their trails are loop trails, but they recognize the problem right at the first. They said on loop trails, people don't know which way to go. So they created new signage to say, you go this way. And so what happens, it makes it a lot easier for hikers to do the social distancing and not have to worry about a hiker passing by from ahead and vice versa. And they said this is one of the things we learned. They also learned about parking lots. And parking lots is big over in UK. They're now putting signs saying the parking lot is closed. If you park anywhere else, we're going to ticket you and tow you away. And so, and a lot of those problems came about because you weren't allowed to carpool anymore because you had to be in that bubble, like a family bubble.
Right.
There was more cars, and that was one of the things that we looked at when we did we were going to try to do the 3 peaks this year. Was, hold now, if those teams aren't in the bubble, that means we're going from 24 cars to almost 100 cars, and there's no parking lots, with exception of Skyline, that can actually do that. And we said, no, there's one problem we got. And so like you said, you really have to open up and kind of look at all the different angles in order to understand how we tackle this COVID-19 challenges that we have to face. I know that in UK, there was a document that came out recently that any groups that want to lead hikes that are more than 6 people and less than 30, they have to fill out a risk assessment, and it has to be posted on the Long Distance Walker Association's website, and they also have to follow up another report at the end to say how things went. And this could be a time where we may have to work with insurance people more often, but that's a kind of new angle. And I know that Janet Barlow, with executive with Hike Nova Scotia, she said now when we do our fall hiking series, everything is pre-registration. There's no walk-ons. Everything is, you can only have 10 in a group, and that includes your leader. And you have to do almost like a little risk assessment, say how many cars can you put in that parking lot and stuff like that. So it is really changing things, but maybe that's a good thing. So anyway, Kelly, on behalf of the Hike the Highlands Festival Society, we'd like to thank you for your presentation today and helping people understand the changes and how operation affects with COVID-19. And thank you for your insights. And I like those top tips from the visitor survey that you did. I think they're right on. And I'm sure everybody will learn from that. So thanks again for coming on today.
Great. Thank you, Tom.